Now, a little bit closer to home, uh, I'm going to go through a few slides on basics of telescopes. We all miss Second Saturday as much as you do, and uh, through this session, we're going to replicate some of the conversations that we normally have on Second Saturday night, either on the sky deck or under the dome. Hopefully, you'll learn a little bit more about the instruments that we use to look at the night sky. So basically, there are three parts to a telescope system, even though we like to call it a telescope. The three components, though, all have their individual importance and their needs for the scope. The first one is the optical tube or the telescope. The second is the mount, one of the most important things. That's what holds the telescope steady and points it where we want it to go. And the last item is the eyepiece. Early telescopes had just an optical tube with a second lens that was the eyepiece. But in later generations, we've separated that, and that has a very important purpose in its own right. So, what's the purpose of a telescope? It's to collect and focus light. It's a common misconception that it magnifies the light. It doesn't. It just collects a lot of it and focuses it into a smaller area so we can see it better. Various types of lenses and mirrors get arranged and are firmly mounted with respect to each other to create the telescope. There are three primary types of telescopes: a refractor, which is made up of lenses, a reflector, which is constructed out of mirrors, and a catadioptric or compound, which uses mostly mirrors, but also has some lens elements also. Tonight, we're going to talk about a refractor telescope. Now, all telescopes, no matter what kind, they have some common characteristics. First, aperture, most important, the size of the objective. That defines how much light it can collect. Second item is the focal length. So that's the distance from the light gathering device to where the focal point is. Third is the focal ratio, and that's simply the focal length divided by the aperture, but it's also referred to as the speed because the shorter a telescope's focal length, the faster the light will get from the objective to the focus point. And finally, magnification is not really a characteristic of the telescope alone. Magnification is calculated by dividing the eyepiece focal length into the focal length of the telescope. And useful magnification for any telescope is usually around 2 times the aperture if you measure the aperture in millimeters, or 50 times the aperture if you measure it in inches. So when you get that new telescope at Christmas and it's a 60 millimeter aperture telescope, you should be able to see about 120 times magnification, but that's under ideal conditions. Now, getting a little bit deeper into refractors. So again, as I said, lenses are used as the objective of a refractor. On the left-hand side of the picture we have here, that's the aperture, and light enters the aperture and gets focused at the end of the focal length on the right side of the picture. This is the first and most familiar type of telescope. It was invented in 1608 by three Dutchmen, opticians. Hans Lippershey is given credit for the invention, but Zacharias Janssen and Jacob Matthias also came up with designs at the same time. There was a famous spat with the patent office, and Lippershey won that. Galileo used the telescope in 1609 after reading about it, and uh, his type of telescope, which is a very simple telescope, is called the Galilean telescope, and it uses just a single objective. But with that, he was able to create an instrument that could magnify things up to 30 times. And he was able to see the four moons of Jupiter. He's able to see mountains and craters on the moon, rings of Saturn, and the Milky Way. Revolutionized astronomy at the time. Today, entry-level refractors have two lenses at the front, and they're called achromats. By using two lenses, that improves the optical quality because the different colors of different wavelengths of light are aligned and focused at the same point. But it's still not perfect. The highest quality are apochromats, which use three or more elements as lenses. And that gets the crispest, most clear pictures. As you get a bit larger with refractors, they become very unwieldy. The largest refractor ever built is a great Yerkes refractor in Wisconsin. That has an aperture of 40 inches. But to house a 40-inch objective, the focal length has to be 42 feet long. This refractor weighs more than 20 tons with its mount. Very hard to use, but revolutionary at the time. That was built in 1893, so it's quite old. Now, when you're looking through a refractor, as I said before, the light comes in through the aperture and reaches a focal point at the end of the focal length. You use an eyepiece to take that light that's been focused at the focal point and make it so that you can see it through your eye. When you look through a refractor, the image is inverted, both upside down and left to right. If you look at the snowman with the top hat in the bottom right of this picture and watch the different color lines, you can see why that happens. The objective lens focuses the light, but then the light keeps traveling on that path until the eyepiece grabs the light and focuses it for your eye. Magnification is one of those characteristics we talked about earlier. And this image shows you how that works. When you use same objective, same telescope, but you use different eyepieces, the magnification changes. If you use a long focal length eyepiece, then the image is smaller. If you use a short focal length eyepiece, the image gets more magnified. But as you do that, you lose quality of the image. Contrast goes away. So it's a dimmer image. So on any night, and those of you who visit the observatory, you know that we're always changing the eyepieces we use to match the conditions that we have. Now, at JGMO, we have several refractors. You might recognize the main telescope stack. On the top is a Takahashi refractor. Mark mentioned that earlier. It's one of our primary imaging devices. It's very high quality. I mentioned that Higher quality uh, telescopes have 3 or more lenses. That one actually has 4 lenses, 2 in the front and 2 near the rear. Also on the main stack, there is another refractor, which is a simpler doublet refractor. That's a Meade. The Meade is a 5-inch aperture and about a 1,000 millimeter focal length. The Takahashi, which is much shorter, is only a 4-inch aperture and a 500 millimeter focal length. JGM also owns, was very lucky to have it donated to us, a antique refractor that was made by John Benjamin Dancer sometime around 1860. Maybe a few years before, maybe a few years after, we don't know for sure. That happens to be a little over 4 inches, 4¼ inches in aperture, and 61 inches in focal length. It's a very interesting instrument to see. And despite it being 160 years old, the image in the middle of the moon was taken through that. So even 160 years ago, they were creating instruments that were able to do real science and see awesome images of the moon. Okay. The next part of this telescope basic series will be reflectors, then catadioptrics, and finally with mounts in other second Saturdays. Thank you. And now we'll open it up to questions from the audience. There's about a 30-second delay. So we'll just mention that we're hopeful to be able to open up the observatory in the coming months. We will keep you updated through our website and during second Saturday.
I don't see any questions, but we do have a couple of comments. Ben Thompson says, "Thanks, Mark. Great pictures. Interesting to see the difference between what the eye sees versus what can be captured in a picture." Ben also says, "Bill, nice pic from your road trip." Peter Corrigan says, "We can't wait for Thursday. Go mission tomorrows. Thanks for all this fun info." And Jane Lambert says, "So happy to see this picture. I haven't seen the dancer in person yet. It's beautiful." And nice job, John. Thanks for hosting. Janet Parlato asks, "How does cold weather affect large scopes?"
Well, cold weather is always better for telescopes. The air is stiller and creates less turbulence that we have to see through. It's interesting, if you visited the observatory, we always have our largest scope, which is a 16-inch aperture scope. We didn't talk about that tonight. And we all have some smaller instruments. I'm normally there with a 4-inch refractor. Mark is there with a 10-inch SCT. Roger's there with another 10-inch SCT. But sometimes the 16-inch does not give us the best image. And that's especially in warm nights where there's a lot of turbulence in the air and there's bad seeing. In the winter, though, it is the best time for us to use the large scope. Now, beyond that, I don't know that I can make any comments on even larger telescopes. Obviously, the mechanical systems in extreme cold get harder to use, but they're usually relatively sturdy. Cold is an astronomer's friend.
Another random note I'll throw in as an imager. Um, you generally want your telescope to be ambient temperature, like you want it to be the temperature it is outside when you're imaging. Um, Aside from the air just being more stable when it's colder, like if you take a telescope from inside and move it outside, you can end up with some thermal turbulence within the telescope. Because if your telescope is the temperature of your inside of the house, you bring it to a cold night outside, as the telescope cools, there's going to be a thermal current as the warm air and the cold air displace each other within the telescope tube that can manifest as distortion sometimes in an image. It kind of looks like if you've ever opened a window on a cold night and looked up at the moon, you might see it like kind of shimmering, or if you're looking at something through like a campfire, you can see the heat kind of distort things behind it. You kind of get that same effect through telescopes if they're not at ambient temperature.
Excellent comment, Marcus. And especially there's also the thermal mass of the glass itself, and
Right.
that takes time to cool down to ambient also.
Yep. Looks like that'll do it, John.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the March 2nd Saturday. Look for our announcement on our website and in our monthly newsletter. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the weekend and have a good Valentine's Day tomorrow.